relatively quickly. We want to just close out, following on that bit, about a little bit more in recognition and reward in a slightly broader context. And it really comes down to institutional culture, and each institution has its own culture and its own history which has driven that. And it's really important to bring research, scholarship, creative activity, and engagement into the campus discourse, to build that culture of inquiry, that culture of creating new knowledge, and how that infuses the learning experience in different ways for faculty, for students, for the campus community, and in the curriculum, in this really sort of integrated and holistic way that we've emphasized throughout the presentation. The faculty as a whole, into individual departments and at the institution, really need to engage in a dialogue about what constitutes appropriate scholarly inquiry in the respective fields, and what is the role of undergraduates, or if we're talking to an institution as a graduate program, how does the synergy is there? Because as we were talking about earlier, there is rigor in all fields. We're most of the time just not knowledgeable of those other fields to understand it. So it's critically important, we think, for entire campuses to observe models from peer and aspirant institutions. So you can see how it's working on different institutions, and you guys have been doing that very nicely for sure. As we talked about earlier, it's important to define disciplinary standards for scholarship. As a biologist, I really don't know what defines rigorous scholarly work in the arts. I don't practice in that field, I don't read that literature, I don't engage in it, I don't know what's appropriate in the arts. Artists do. So we need to develop standards that are discipline-based, that are aligned with the mission of the institution. You don't need Penn State requirements here. The mission of Penn State is different than the mission of Albright College. We don't need Rutgers standards at TCNJ. Rutgers has a different mission than TCNJ does. We need standards that make sense for our own. As we talked about, we really need to define the intersections between the teacher and the scholar roles and bring those together in really meaningful ways. And we feel very strongly and passionate that undergraduate research and creative activity is where that can happen in the most effective way. We often get this question: how do you count undergraduate research? Is it teaching or is it scholarship? As we've talked about, it's both. And it needs to be counted and recognized and valued in the institutional culture and seminal documents and policies in meaningful ways. The mentoring component can and should be recognized in the area of teaching, as we've talked about through building it into load, mentoring students in independent research and other high-impact practices. The outcome component can and should be recognized as scholarship. So by simply mentoring students in research, if that doesn't yield outcomes, then it shouldn't be counted, then that shouldn't be recognized as scholarship. But your community needs to discuss what that means and what is the role of scholarship and what is the role of mentoring. Each campus needs to do that. So we'll end where we started. The faculty role really is about being a dynamic, lifelong learner and living that for ourselves, living that for our campus, and living and modeling that for our students, and bringing our students into that wonderful world that it is to be engaged in this kind of activity throughout one's life. So we're going to stop there, and if there's time, we're delighted to take specific questions or just have conversation and discussion. Yeah.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask if the alternate assignment in place of scholarship, is that a permanent option or is that a temporary option in the development of the teacher scholar?
At TCNJ, again, it was designed ideally to be set up for faculty who are hired at a point in time when they didn't have an active program of scholarship. All of our faculty now that are hired in the last decade, there's an expectation of engaging in scholarship in the last 2 decades. We have language of the teacher scholar in the last decade to 15 years. For the last 2 decades, have the expectation. So we haven't sort of built it in sort of as an opt-out model. But it's not just you have an active program of scholarship and you have an alternate assignment. There's conversation between the faculty member and the department chair and the dean in some cases to develop a plan to engage in scholarly activity, to sort of re-energize, to build into faculty development programs throughout the institution.
Is that done on an individual basis?
On an individual basis.
And I have to say there are some wonderful stories. When we first started implementing that,
in conversation with these individuals, what we found were individuals who were really unhappy that they were in this, environment, and they knew they weren't pulling their weight in terms of this part that had become important at the institution. And they were frustrated by that. They wanted to be engaged. They wanted to be, to have a way to engage in their discipline in their field in a meaningful way. So there are some really wonderful stories of connecting, individually with individuals and really developing a plan for engaging in some form of scholarship and really being successful with that. So there's a really good story there to tell.
A key piece is it's not punitive. It's not punitive at all. It's about contributing in a different way. It's most meaningful to that particular faculty member and to the needs of the institution, and hopefully to re-engage.
Some of the most challenging teaching experiences can be the large lecture courses or introductory courses, and there are certainly pedagogies that are better for that than others. How does this model acknowledge that sort of introductory course?
It depends on the pedagogies you're using in those kinds of settings. One of the reasons that at the College of New Jersey there are two versions of the lecture-oriented course is that we recognize that there is one version that really is lecture-oriented, and there's another version that has a much more interactive discussion or other kind of interactive pedagogy built into it, and you'll see that the target enrollments for those are different. So that was one of the ways that we recognize it. What you see up here is not a pecking order of pedagogies. It is not a value-based system in terms of what's valued more. So in other words, we're not saying that, a course that has 5 people in it is valued more than a course that has 45 people in it.
I think of more in terms of the rewards or the recognition in terms of the faculty member, not the end point. How is it acknowledged in the merit system or whatever system?
It's not. I mean, it's, you're engaged in different kinds of pedagogies, and the expectation is that you're effective in being engaged in any one of them. So it's, if I'm understanding your question right, all of these kinds of pedagogies are valued, and it's the effectiveness that is evaluated.
And ideally, in a practical setting for departments or academic units, there's a balance of what faculty members are teaching over the course of a year or 2 or 3 year period. So, one faculty member is not teaching all the introductory courses every single semester, every single year, to a large number of courses, and another faculty member is only teaching seminars and independent research courses in sciences, for example. But there's balance among the teaching effort, and that's worked out largely among the department. You can agree.
Yeah. Could you talk about the pairing of the adjective accessible with the noun scholar? Because there would be a model, and there has been historically in universities, of people who were lone wolves, who were off doing their own research, who were off presenting to their peers, but who were not particularly accessible individuals. And perhaps the subject matter wasn't adapted well to an undergraduate, but sometimes just in terms of physically and in terms of time and in mood, they weren't people who were approachable.
I'll start with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So clearly there are disciplines and even sub-disciplines within fields that do it regularly where the scholarly work is solitary, and it's really sort of foreign to even think about collaborating with a professional colleague, let alone an undergraduate student. And that's okay to some degree. I think on our campus there are fields where it's much more deeply engaged, where it's more immersed and integrated into fields, and others where it's less so. We didn't build in the sort of the defined requirement of students coming into scholarship early on. We're doing that actually now in a rewrite of some of our documents. But what we have found at our own institutions and through Kerr and doing visits like this is that in disciplines where faculty are working in sort of in isolation, when they start to learn about the kinds of things that are happening in other fields, or one faculty member in that department does an experience and mentors some students, everyone else gets excited about it and kind of sees that they can do it. The other thing that I think is really important to affect that is, the science model doesn't work in the humanities. It doesn't work in the arts. So it needs, the conventions of the discipline need to be, sort of used. And one of the things that we say is often, send, even if a faculty member isn't having students, send them to the National Conference on Undergraduate Research. 2,500 to 3,000 students are presenting from all disciplines. And you can go and see some beautiful examples where there's some fabulous scholarly work happening in those fields. So we've done that, and we've sent faculty from disciplines that don't do it, and they come back, wow, these are some great examples how we might do it in our field.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are lots of different ways to engage students as a scholar. So I have a colleague that I've been thinking a lot about today, because we were talking a little bit before about the teacher-scholar document that was created at the College of New Jersey before we even started this, and it was something, I was pretty urgent that we really needed to have that conversation. And the provost at the time appointed a colleague who I treasure, who is an English professor, to chair that. And this person and I have wrestled with this teacher-scholar concept for a long time, amiably, but we have wrestled with it for a long time. And he kept on maintaining that it's impossible for me to intersect myself as a teacher and myself as a scholar in the field of English. It's impossible. So we had this very defining moment about a year and a half after he chaired that committee to write that document. And part of the reason why that document didn't go as far as it could have is because of that, he just insisted that that couldn't happen. Two things happened. Number one is that he worked with a student in the summer doing some research. He's a Whitman scholar. So he worked in the summer with a student who did some library research for him, some archive research for him. And she discovered a Whitman poem that had never been discovered before. It was stuck in some pages of a book of his, and it had never been found. And so she proceeded to do the research and to identify this poem and to write an article that he was supportive of. Okay, so that had to change his mind a little bit. And then he was working on a book. He was working on a book on celebrity politics. And he, it's different, right? We have Whitman and we have celebrity politics, yeah. Okay, so, but anyway. And he did a faculty brown bag one day. And it was in progress. So he was working on certain pieces of it, and he was stuck on a couple of pieces on it. And so he did a faculty brown bag. Well, someone brought a whole class of students to the faculty brown bag because it was relevant to what they were doing. And it was mostly students, actually, to whom he was giving this brown bag. And they engaged with him in critical thinking about the problems of where he was right now. I'm stuck on chapter 4. Here's what I'm trying to work out. I can't quite figure out this piece. I can't quite figure out that piece. These students, I was there, I watched it. These students engaged with him and helped him through his stuckness.
Sure. Well, they understand celebrity.
That is teacher-scholar engagement.
Yeah.
So it can look like all different things. He was a convert, I'm happy to say.